Hey guys, how's it going? Hope everybody's doing okay. This is our exam 3 review session. Just quickly go through the slides and touch on some key points, and then also go through the exam and highlight some specific things that I'd like you to know. So, alright, let's get started. So we talked about this last section of the course. We started by talking about qualitative research, and in particular in-depth interviews. So what we wanted to learn from lecture 9, this stuff about what service are we providing. So really that's just to that sort of acronym, or that idea is just to reinforce the idea that often the thing that we think we're doing as a service provider, as a marketer, isn't really what's driving purchase. And often, again, that consumers don't understand why they do the things that they do. So that the whole idea behind depth interviews is we can dig into people's subconscious and get at insights that they couldn't have generated otherwise. And so this is what's unique about the technique, is that it can get at these sort of deep nuggets of information that allow you to have some sort of competitive advantage if you understand really what's driving people's thinking and behavior. All right, so the idea behind ZMET and depth interviews is that, and what depth interviews look like. So essentially, depth interviews are pretty straightforward. It's a different style of talking to someone. And instead of trying to meet them halfway in the middle and speed the conversation along, what you're trying to do is slow the conversation down and just listen for opportunities to probe and ladder, which we will talk about later. All right, so why this material is relevant. So I think it's important to understand what depth interviews do, and it's a strategic marketing tool. And also, if you can, it's a useful skill in life to be able to understand people's perspectives, and that's what depth interviews are all about. Also, more practically, being able to do a depth interview or talk to someone in sort of depth interview mode is kind of a useful way to talk to people, because it lets them do most of the talking, which people usually like. All right, here we go. So again, the idea behind the what service are we providing stuff is that consumers oftentimes don't really understand what's driving their choices. And so the famous example is Starbucks, where why did Starbucks come to power? Was it because their coffee was so awesome, or was it because they were providing a prestige brand, or maybe this third place? Sometimes companies stumble upon this stuff accidentally, but if you can, use depth interviews to get some deep insights, that can be a useful way of getting a competitive advantage. All right. So the next thing we would have done in class is to take out the piece of paper and write down things that pop in our head when I said Coca-Cola. The point of that is to illustrate that we all have these sort of shared and individual schemas for how we understand something. So in our brain, if we were to crack it open, this is what knowledge looks like. It's the way we understand any one concept is in its relation to other concepts, which is the fundamental premise, or one of the fundamental premises of this ZMET technique that we talked about in class, and was the paper that we read. And the key premises are, again, consumers really have very little insight into how they feel about things or why they do the things they do. So this is something we see over and over again in research. And that schemas are how people understand the world. So if you want to understand how people understand the world, maybe it's good to tap into metaphors. And also that thoughts occur as images, which is why ZMET in particular is an image-based technique. So what ZMET does, if you'll remember, they ask people to collect images and say that relate to their thoughts and feelings about some topic. Now, when you're coming up with a ZMET project, something that's important to remember, and something that's important on the exam, is that you want to, when you ask people to think about their thoughts and feelings about some topic, there's often a balance. So if you ask them for something too specific, sometimes you get very sort of generic, top-level, focus group level kind of comments. If you ask them for something really obscure, then you often get these really interesting ideas, but it may not be related to the topic you're interested in. So on the exam, there'll be a question that gives you sort of 3 possible ZMET questions. One that looks pretty specific, and it's like, well, that is what we want to know about, but I don't know if people have a lot of creative thoughts about that. Then there'll be one that's really interesting, and people probably have a lot of cool creative thoughts about it, but maybe not really be our topic of interest. And then there'll be one that's kind of in the middle. And so the right answer on the exam, and if you're ever doing one of these studies, is to pick the one in the middle, because you want to give people opportunity to sort of push their thinking to a sort of abstract level, but you also want those results to be usable. So anyway, this screen we're looking at here is screenshots of some ZMET project collages. So the step 10 of the ZMET process, that you take the images that people brought in, you combine them into one single collage. So this is what some of them look like. So anyway, all right. Interviews, how it's done. So this is a clip from an actual ZMET interview, and I think it's a good example of what happens during an in-depth interview. People often say it feels like they were sort of on the couch at a psychiatrist's office, talking about their inner feelings and subconscious thoughts that they never thought about before. People are often exhausted after it. And what do you do as the interviewer? Well, it's actually pretty simple. You do 2 basic things. You just listen for people to say interesting words, and or metaphors or similes. And when you hear something like that, you probe those things that are interesting. You say, "Oh, you said this. Could you tell me a little bit more what you meant by that?" So that's probing. And then when you feel you understand that, you ladder that concept. You say, well, why is that important to you? What would happen if that wasn't there? And those are essentially the 2 basic types of questions you need to conduct an in-depth interview. And if you only just sort of listen for people to say interesting things and say, oh, that's interesting. What do you mean? Tell me more about that. Or what do you mean by that? And ladder, like, oh, why is that important? You can talk to people for 2 hours with only those 2 questions. So this is another interesting thing about in-depth interviews, is that as the interviewer, you really want to talk as little as possible. Your goal is to develop a rapport with the person and then give them an opportunity to talk in detail. All right. What you don't want to do is inject your own bias or understanding or yourself in any way into the conversation. So anytime someone in your discussion is saying, well, you know what I mean, resist the urge to say, oh yeah, I know what you mean, because really you often don't, right? They're trying their hardest to communicate their subconscious, and they're looking for help with that, and they'll often want you to meet them halfway. Don't meet them halfway. So try to avoid letting yourself bias the conversation. Laddering, again, laddering is the idea of we go from sort of low-level attributes up to more interesting details about something. It could be from attributes of a product up to values, concrete attributes up to terminal values. And so again, it's this idea of repeatedly asking somebody, well, what does that get you? Okay, well, now what does that get you? Okay, now what does that get you? And you've sort of fully laddered when they start talking about their values or their self-actualization, that sort of thing. All right, so these are just different laddering techniques. Many of you use these in your assignment 3. Rich comments, again, anytime we see a simile, anytime people repeat something, anytime people start to say, well, it's like this, that's when they're really kind of digging and sort of getting at those schemas. Probing, we know what probing is because hopefully you had a chance to practice it a lot. So essentially, that lecture was mostly designed to, again, sort of give you the ideas that really oftentimes consumers don't really understand why they do the things we do. And these depth interviews are a sort of a strategic way of getting at new novel insights that can then be a competitive advantage. And the tool for doing those is actually pretty simple. It's just essentially these two questions, probing and laddering. And probing is just hearing something interesting, saying, what did you mean by that? And laddering is trying to figure out, working that concept up the value chain until you get something related to the person's self or their values, and then you go on to the next question. All right, so speaking of moving on to the next thing, let's go into the data analysis lecture. So what we wanted to learn out of this, we want to talk a little about grounded theory, some coding terminology, and how we go about coding data, and also whether or not we can automate this process, because this is something that people are always interested in doing. As a spoiler, you can't really. All right, how this material is relevant. It's nice to have a sense for how qualitative data is dealt with when people do it at a really high standard. And so just understanding that will help you hold qualitative data to a higher standard in general. Because this is oftentimes what we make a lot of decisions based on, is this sort of qualitative secondhand anecdotes, and just sort of understanding the extent to which it could be analyzed carefully will maybe make you more skeptical of qualitative data that isn't analyzed carefully. All right, so for our project and for the ZMET process, the end product for grounded theory is sort of a mental map. And so what a mental map is, essentially it's a picture that describes some sort of theory about how the world works. So grounded theory is essentially building theory from the ground up. So it's a exploratory technique, and it's not for testing hypotheses. So you ideally, in some sense, you come to a grounded theory project not really having any idea about what might turn out to be the theory. You just ask your probing and laddering questions, you analyze your data, as we're going to talk about, and you see what happens. That's not always the case, so sometimes academics take what's called a theory-driven approach. Basically what... forget it. It usually involves French philosophy and would never be seen outside the confines of a university. All right. So grounded theory, on the other hand, is this idea of just gathering facts and using those facts to, in some sort of systematic way, generate some understanding about what's going on. All right, so it's like a archaeological dig site where you're looking for information, only instead of digging up old bones, you're digging through some sort of text or web pages or Twitter tweets or whatever it is. Okay, and what you do in grounded theory is you have to go through the text or whatever it is you're analyzing line by line and look for things that are interesting, what we're calling units of thought. And you code those, and then as a next step you collapse those code, and then you eventually construct some sort of theory, either in a consensus map format or some other format. And so essentially, again, the idea here is that it's a very rigorous process where you really go through every piece of the data and look at it and think about that piece of data and try to identify the key important pieces and use that to develop your understanding of what's going on. It's a very labor-intensive kind of thing, which is why I don't recommend it for a final project. So if it's done correctly, you really have to sit there with the data for hours and hours and sort of really let it mull it over before you can come up with one of these theories. So can you automate this? Not really. So there's maybe some things, but like word clouds or sentiment analysis, but essentially those are just give you a very surface level. What we're looking for is some much more creative idea, which we'll talk about a little later. All right, so how do we go about getting this? So the way we analyze data is we develop these codes. So you go through the text, you identify something you think is interesting, and then what you do is you boil it down. You take maybe a paragraph and you boil it down into 3 or 4 words that capture the essence of that paragraph. Or maybe it's a sentence, or maybe it's even a part of a sentence. or maybe you have a sentence that's really interesting and it gets 2 different codes. But whatever it is, you're continually taking sort of a large amount of data and repeatedly boiling it down until you arrive at sort of the essence of what's going on. And so this is the first stage in that, is developing these codes. 2 to 4 words usually is a good amount that you can go back later and say, oh yeah, I kind of remember what I was thinking at that time. It's a creative process, so you're really trying to use your sensitivity or creativity as a researcher to try to really understand what's going on, but at the same time you want to try to be very objective. You don't want to see a cool idea in there and get excited about that and run around looking for that cool idea in all the other data. You really want to try to remain true to the participants' words and what they were trying to communicate to you during all the probing and laddering that was going on. And, again, avoid this bias, which tends to be one of the biggest problems. All right, so it's important to be objective, but at the same time, you're trying to be creative, which is kind of a tough thing to do. Just some practical coding tips. You don't just code instances of a word, but you can use the word in your code. You want to have codes that are rich enough in their meaning, so 2 to 4 to 5 words, that 8 weeks later when you're looking at this, at the end you understand what it means. You can always condense. It's not as easy to go back and take codes that, when you use the same code for things that were different, and break them apart again. All right. You can have more than one code in a sentence. Don't over-condense. There's no target number of code. Memos are things that people use in qualitative research to jot down these aha moments. So when we're working with qualitative data, we really want to be thinking and trying to be creative and understand what's going on. And every once in a while, one of these light bulbs will go off and be like, oh, I wonder if this really is kind of the essence, or I wonder if this is what's happening here. And when that happens, a good thing to do is to make a memo. And so in qualitative software, you usually have options to assign codes to things, and you have the options to insert memos. And memos are not a code. It may be a paragraph or a couple sentences that really say, hey, I had this kind of light bulb moment where here's what I really think is going on. So that's another part of code. So when you're coding, you're looking for units of thought, and those units of thought will be a simile, something you probed on was probably a good example for good material for a code, something that was laddered, something that was sort of rich and interesting. Sometimes, so the essence of this is that it's important not to overcode or overuse the same code, because we might have something like happens here where something is different kinds of intenseness. So we have a good intenseness in this case and a bad intensity. And so like the bad intensity is scary, but the good intensity is like exciting and fun. So if we just encoded them all intense, we would lose that sort of understanding. All right, so we would in class have tried some coding, and you guys did that on your own this time around. Once you do all your coding, you've gone through and you've tried to code everything in detail. What you do next is to collapse instances where you could have used the same code. So as we go through and code things, we try not to overuse the same code to make sure we don't miss out on any meaning. But in that process, sometimes we create too many codes. So in essence, what categorizing is collapsing codes that could have been the same into some title. And when we do that, what we want to do is we want to maintain the meaning of the initial code. So we have on the exam, there'll probably be an instance of good coding and bad coding. You have to pick which one is better. So if you look at the codes on the left, we've coded sort of superficially as emotions. So we have in there things like I want to cry, and at the same time I'm excited to see what is next. Those things seem fundamentally different, right? We also have events like going to a party and like going to a funeral. Those are very different things. Right? Maybe they don't belong under the same heading, even though they're all superficially tied to some sort of metaphor for an event. Probably, something a better coding would be something like a feeling of loss. So feels like a funeral, missing you, leaving home are all related to feeling losses, even though some of them refer to events and some of them refer to feelings. So when we collapse, we want to collapse sort of thoughtfully into things that really maintain the essence of what those codes were about. Tools that help us do that are things like qualitative software like NVivo, Atlas. There's a new one on an online version, which we're using now, called Deduce. And all these things do is basically help you keep track of your codes, which we did in Word. But if you're doing a more substantial product with like hundreds and hundreds of pages of text, something like this would be pretty useful. There's also an old one that was called Nudist that was pretty popular for a while. I don't know if it's still around, but... Alright, so we would try this in class and sort of work on it, but hopefully you had a chance to do that again yourself. Mapping, again, the idea is that you're just showing how these different categories that you have created sort of relate to one another. And what you do is you create categories for multiple people, and then you overlap them, and you see which people share, which categories keep appearing over and over again. So that's a common outcome for a lot of these qualitative and ZMET projects. Okay, so moving on to the last lecture, which was focus groups and other stuff. So what we were expected to learn in here is some strength, hint, and mostly weaknesses of focus groups, some other qual tactics, and you finish up with usability testing. So for this, we watched some focus group videos just to kind of frame our discussion. So hopefully you had a chance to do that. But pretty much everyone, I think, is familiar with what a focus group looks like. A group of people sitting around some table with a moderator talking about some topic. What's interesting about focus group moderating is and we're sort of getting into a theme here with the last lecture, that what you need to do to be a good focus group moderator is the same thing essentially you need to do to be a good in-depth interviewer. Try not to interject your own opinions, don't ask yes or no questions, just guide the discussion and be a good listener. So focus groups, what they're good for, they are good for identifying fundamental flaws. So the idea here is that when you are so close to something, you really can't see it in the same way that people who are encountering it for the first time see it. So the video here was the Silicon Valley focus group, where Richard and his engineer friends totally got the platform that they were trying to create, but people who weren't computer engineers had no idea what was going on. They were seeing it through a completely different lens. That it said they saved something, but it showed that there was no memory used. So how is that possible? So this is the essence of the thing about focus groups that they're good at. So when you're so close to something because you're an expert and because you think about tires or toilet paper or computer algorithms every day, you're not going to be able to look at it in the same way as a stranger would. So a focus group, in my opinion, what they're really good for is identifying fundamental flaws that you can't see because you're so close to the product. They have, however, very, very many disadvantages. So one is that they are superficial. People are, just like in class, people are reluctant to say anything that might be a little weird or not well formed or not well received. So people only tend to say things that are easily articulated, that are easily understood by other people, and that they think will be well received. They're also very vulnerable to strong personalities. So once someone jumps out in front with something that's easily articulated and well received, then people start to pile on. So this is like in the video that we watched, the salad dressing cap and how excited everybody got. Because somebody jumped off of and started discussing how great it was, and then everybody jumped on. And when that happens, you get what's this groupthink dynamics, where everyone reinforcing each other tends to lead to these sort of extreme conclusions. They don't have the depth that an in-depth interview will have, because you're really not asking people to sort of challenge themselves and dig deep into their subconscious in a way they really don't understand. You're just asking them to generate these sound bites for the group. And so they're prone to but they're very vivid, and their people hold a lot of stock in them even when they shouldn't. All right. Other qualitative tools are out there as well. Oftentimes, it just ends up being conversations. The thing about conversations is once you've seen how they're not analyzed in any way. Typically, you just go out and talk to people and get some sense for what's going on. The thing is, like, once you understand like how qualitative data should be analyzed, that they sort of become less exciting. That you talk to 100 potential customers because you didn't analyze that data in any rigorous way. You could also do something like a sentence completion test. So the point of this slide is just to show you that qualitative research doesn't have to be an interview face-to-face. It can also be done on a Qualtrics survey, with something like a critical incident question. Tell me what made you most satisfied or dissatisfied about your experience. Or sentence completion tests, or if you're in the psychology department, some weird, write a story about this strange picture kind of thing. So there's lots of other ways to do qualitative research that don't necessarily involve in-depth interviews or focus groups. It can be as simple as a Qualtrics survey with an open-ended box. All right, moving on to our last topic, which is usability studies. Usability studies, it's a big deal right now. They're seen as like being very successful. There's some histogram on like how companies are trying to do more and more of them. It's this idea of growth hacking, or continually improving something and then testing it and improving it again, improving it again. Things about usability tests: you can have all sorts of different things. You can have people look at a website for 5 seconds and give their impressions. The most common one is to give them some sort of formative task and ask them to do it and take notes. So that's more of a qualitative. Both these two are sort of qualitative. You can also have them do quantitative stuff as well. What's interesting to me in the analysis of the qualitative stuff is it's essentially the same way we would analyze any sort of qualitative data. People look for quotes, they organize those quotes into different groups, and then they sort of further collapse them until they come up with some sort of theory about where the key weaknesses in the product are. So essentially, we have some tips for conducting these interviews. Again, develop rapport. Moderators should talk as little as possible. Make sure that people don't feel threatened, that it's the product being tested, not them. Again, all of these are very similar recommendations that you would have as an in-depth interview. These skills repeat themselves in focus groups and again in usability testing. Again, the quantitative part, essentially you can do a lot of A/B testing in usability. So all the skills that we used in experiments also apply to usability testing in a quantitative way. So we want to pick good DVs that are ratio data and have normally distributed, and use that in some sort of A/B test, and maybe put a confidence interval on our bar charts to see whether A is better than B. All the good stuff that we did with experiments we would want to do for quantitative usability studies. So again, I think if you feel good about the second section of the course, that set of skills applies to a lot of different ways. So that was my final thoughts on the class. Is that in my opinion anyway, the stuff we learned in here is sort of very foundational market research skills. So how to do a survey and measure things correctly, how to do a good A/B test and manipulate something and compare those two bar charts in a rigorous way, how to go about collecting good, rich, qualitative data and how to analyze that in a rigorous way. And if you kind of have a sense for those things, then you're pretty well on your way to be able to tackle pretty much any marketing research challenge. So, all right, so that was the less than quick go through of the last third of the course. And now at 30 minutes in, I'm going to go through the actual questions. So for the exam, what I would like you to do is create a dream ZMet interview like you did for assignment 3. just exactly the same. So if you'll remember, assignment 3, the instructions were from this exam. I'm going to ask you to do the same thing for the exam. Only I'm going to ask you to share your thoughts and feelings about your phone. So I thought that would be a topic that everyone had good thoughts and feelings about. And so you can prepare this in advance. In fact, I encourage you to prepare it in advance. Do basically a redo of assignment 3. Only this time it's your thoughts and feelings about your phone. And when we get to the exam time, what you can do is copy that and paste it into question 1 of the exam. Know what a good use for focus groups are, what they're good for. Sort of more trivia, know what ZMET stands for. We did talk a lot about it, so it seems like maybe you should know what it stands for. The Zaltman Metaphor Elicitation Technique. All right, that question I mentioned about knowing how to ask a good ZMET question, something that's not too specific so that you get only superficial things, something that's not too deep so people go off on some weird tangent that's not relevant, but more aim for something in the middle. Know the key premises of the ZMET technique. You mentioned this. Tell me more about that. What do you mean by that? What is that when I say something like that? What does it look like when we ladder? What does it look like when we probe? What are some different types of laddering prompts? How do you know when something has been fully laddered? Well, usually it's because we are hearing people talk about their values or their self-concept. We're sort of reaching a sort of terminal understanding. Statements about grounded theory and why its development. Problems with focus groups, not just what they're good for. Let me look at this one. Some statements about qualitative research that are true or not true. So, understand the issue of creativity versus objectivity, or sensitivity versus objectivity. And know that one of the critiques of because something is creative, like qualitative research, not everyone will come up with the same theory. So I could give 2 very well-qualified researchers the same data and ask them to develop a grounded theory, and they could develop slightly different theories. And so this is a main critique of grounded theory, is that it can't replicate in the same way. So if I handed 2 people, an experiment, an A/B test, both of them are going to come up with the same bar charts and confidence intervals. But if I hand them the same data, qualitative data, they may not come to the same exact conclusion. So that's one of the problems with or the critiques of qualitative research, is that doesn't have this ability to be replicated in the same way that other things do. All right, statements about usability tests. So things about usability tests to know, what they involve. What they're good for. Can they be qualitative or quantitative? Yeah. At the same time? Sure. It's important to make participants know it is not them that is being tested. That's true too. And also, something I may not have mentioned in my review just now is that when you do a usability test, and even when you do an in-depth interview, you can get away with really small sample sizes. Because oftentimes, whatever you learn from those people tends to be a big chunk of the phenomenon. So in the case of a qualitative in-depth studies, the ZMET people say you can identify, I forget, it's like 70% or 80% of the concepts with like the first 5 participants. And in usability testing, they say once you get to 5 participants in your usability test, you've identified more problems than you should be fixing in one go around anyway. So qualitative research can use really small sample sizes. Yeah, there's a hold on a second. So there's a little question about like how we would go about analyzing qualitative data, which is some sort of grounded theory, line by line analysis. How we would go about analyzing quantitative usability test data. Essentially, we want to use the same techniques we used on experiments. And I think that wraps us up. So if you understand everything I talked about in the review here, and you, as I was talking through the individual questions, you kind of had a sense for how you might tackle that question, then you should be good to go. So usually I think people tend to do pretty well on exam 3, so I'm sure you will do well again. And yeah, so good luck and have a great summer. I hope it's a good one. All right, take care.